One night in Mumbai, India, a woman was returning to her apartment after a long day. She also saw a security guard who was fast asleep and an elevator that did not go down. The woman now has choice to take the stairs to her apartment on the 4th floor. Arriving at the door of her apartment, it turned out that the elevator next to her apartment was open. So it was appropriate that the elevator downstairs did not go down. The bell was pressed, but her husband, Srivastav, a movie critic, did not immediately open the door. Finally, the woman entered with a spare key her own, but she was a little suspicious because suddenly the electricity in her house turned off suddenly, even though it was clear that the lights throughout the building were on. After turning on the electricity through the fuse, she called her husband Nitin. Surprisingly, his cell phone ringtone could be heard clearly from the bathroom. She then screamed, and the movie revenge of the artist began. The woman immediately called the police, and the case of Nitin's death was immediately investigated by the Chief Inspector of Police, Head of Crime Branch, Mumbai, Arvind Mathur, and Deputy Superintendent of Police Officer Srinivas Shetty. The victim's condition was so terrible, starting from the many and symmetrical incision wounds all over his body, an inverted triangle-shaped incision on his forehead, as well as his mouth, hands, and feet, which were tied using plastic with a yellow leaf pattern. According to Arvind, the perpetrators probably killed Nitin first by slitting his throat, and when Nitin was dead, then his body was slashed symmetrically. Meanwhile, unfortunately, the apartment building does not have CCTV, and the security guard claimed that Nitin did not have any visitors, and also Nitin did not come out of his unit at all that day. Elsewhere, there was a man named Danny. He was a florist shop owner who loved plants, especially flowers. There seems the gentleness of Danny's attitude as he picks up caterpillars on the ground and moves them to a safer place. However, Danny has a strange habit of talking to himself. Back to Nitin's case, Arvind is convinced that no one broke into his apartment door, because only Nitin and his wife had the keys, so it can be concluded that Nitin himself opened the door for the murderer who entered his apartment. Or in other words, it could be that Nitin knew the killer. According to information so far obtained by the police, the perpetrator used 2 different weapons to slit and slash the victim's body. Nitin and his wife don't have any children either, so this case is not about fighting over property. At work, Nitin worked as a movie critic. Nitin's relationship with his colleagues was also fine, with no problems. Moreover, all the yellow leaf motif plastic that Nitin was bound in also unrecognizable. Meanwhile, an entertainment journalist named Neela Menon came to Nitin's funeral to write a story about him. On her way back, Neela visited to florist shop, that was Danny's shop, to buy some flowers for her mother. But as soon as she sees Danny, Neela is intrigued by him. So is Danny, who is not only attracted to Neela's looks, but also Neela has the same habit of talking to herself. Because Danny insisted on giving her flowers for free, Neela promised to come back another time to pay for the flowers. After mourning Nitin, Arvind also called Srini and explained that the murderer was most likely still in the apartment when Nitin's wife came. Because the apartment bell was still on when the wife pressed the button, and the perpetrator immediately turned off the electricity from the fuse right after the wife pressed the bell, so that means he could escape without being caught. In addition, according to Srini's research, the mysterious plastic found at the crime scene was never printed in any factory. After his first meeting with Neela at the florist shop, Danny accidentally saw her again, this time at the supermarket. Again, Neela's habit of talking to herself makes Danny more interested in her. Even to his curiosity, Danny secretly followed Neela, who was on the way home. Seeing the victim's good family relationship, Arvind concluded that Nitin's murder had something to do with his work as a film critic, because the perpetrator should have also killed his wife when he arrived at the apartment if there was a family connection. So clearly the killer targeted only the film critic Nitin alone. Therefore, it is possible that the perpetrator is someone who hates Nitin's movie reviews. Arvind and his team then decided to meet the directors whose movies had recently received bad reviews from Nitin, and Arvind didn't find anyone suspicious, but they did manage to get a few clues. Starting from the leaf pattern on the plastic at the scene, which was similar to the award labels on movie posters. also the type of plastic that is often used to wrap flowers. Arvind immediately inspected the florist shops around the crime scene, which almost all had plastic. But unfortunately, none had the same pattern, including Danny's florist shop, which never even used plastic to wrap flowers. Instead, it was brown paper to wrap the flowers, as seen when Neela bought the flowers. Right after Arvind and his team left, Neela came back to the shop to pay for her flowers yesterday. They chatted for a while. But Danny's attitude immediately changed 180 degrees as soon as he saw Neela, who turned out not to like talking to herself, but was busy chatting with her friend on AirPods. Even though Danny fell in love with her, because he found someone who had the same habits as him. Danny immediately handed over the payment machine edition without saying a word, so that Neela would pay and leave as soon as possible from there. As Neela walked out of the store, she could hear Danny laughing to himself. 1 week later, another movie critic was murdered. This time, the critic named Urshad Ali died horribly with his body split open on the train tracks. Just like Knighton, Urshad was also tied up in plastic with yellow leaves, but this time the mark on his forehead was a star. Arvind now understands that in the previous murder, the perpetrator also planned to make a star-like on Urshad's forehead, but Knighton's wife came earlier to the house. Stars are the critics' rating symbols for movies, and now it's the killer who's giving the critics a horrible rating. At the market, Danny accidentally meets Neela again. Before approaching her, Danny also chatted to himself, as if he was talking to his other personality to apologize for the previous incident. Danny also paid for the dog candle that Neela wanted to buy. Then they talked casually while walking home, and it turns out from their conversation that Danny's mother has died, but he didn't answer when Neela asked about his father. Meanwhile, Neela lives only with her mother in an apartment next to the movie studio. They seem to be getting closer, and when they parted ways on the street, Danny was seen looking at a movie poster titled Third Umpire and making a gesture swinging a golf club. After the two victims, the perpetrator killed another famous movie critic named Parikshit Prabhu. The critic was killed in an equally sadistic way, namely with the condition of the stomach organs decomposed and the organs scattered but still organized, except for his liver, which was still in the body. In addition, there was a 1.5 stars on the victim's forehead, just like the rating Parikshit gave in the review of the recently released movie, Third Umpire. After Arvind checked the article written by Parikshit, he finally found a big clue, which also related to the previous two cases. It turned out that all the victims were killed according to the articles they wrote respectively. Parikshit said in his article, a movie whose liver was in the right place, but other organs were scattered, exactly like Parikshit's organs, which are scattered everywhere, except for his heart. While the second victim, Urshad, who died on the train tracks, in his article he wrote a satire in the form of, the train was a mess, in accordance with his body, which was torn apart on the train tracks. Then Netin, the first victim, said in his criticism, if the movie he reviewed had many scenes that should have been cut, to the point that he was so bored, Netin often took bathroom breaks while watching. Similar to his condition, he was killed in the bathroom in a cut or slashed state. In addition, the star rating mark on his forehead is the same rating that critics give to movies that have just been reviewed by them. Once they found the common thread or link between the three cases, the police and Arvind immediately held a press conference. In the press conference, Arvind said that the murders clearly targeted movie critics who made low-rated reviews. However, the police still haven't gotten the slightest clue who the culprit is, because so far the police have not found fingerprints or CCTV footage. So the police called movie people, such as directors, producers, and film critics, asked not to give negative reviews to prevent further killings. Unfortunately, critics protested because they thought the police were incompetent in providing security, and the critics also thought that the police were interfering with the critics' work. On the other hand, directors and producers are also annoyed with critics who are difficult to work with, and in the end, the two parts, filmmaker and film critics, even argued with each other. Meanwhile, on Neela's birthday, Danny had prepared paper flowers that he had arranged himself. Danny then presents them directly to Neela at her apartment. Neela was so happy to get the paper flowers, because Danny made the effort to arrange them one by one. There, Danny also met Neela's mother. The mother is blind and doesn't agree with her daughter being approached by a man who is just a florist. While eating, Danny and Neela chatted about Danny's lack of social media and Neela's 4-month move to Mumbai to become an infotainment reporter. But her love for the world of cinema made her want to become a movie critic. But hearing the word movie critic made Danny choke up. It wasn't long before Neela was asked by her boss via voice note to write an article about the late Guru Dutt, a legendary Indian director and artist whose birthday was the next day. In order for Neela to get straight to work, Danny excused himself and said goodbye to Neela and her mother. Afterwards, Neela looks at the flowers Danny gave her and reminds her of Guru Dutt's last movie, Kaagaz Ki Phool, which means flowers made of paper. Since the press conference, the police have focused on monitoring the ratings of every new movie review that comes out. Out of fear, almost all the critics wrote a rating of 3 stars and above except Neela's boss in his office, named Kartik, who dared to give a rating of 1.5 stars. The police immediately guarded Kartik's apartment. Kartik criticized like that not to challenge the killer, but as a journalist, Kartik could not lie to the public because the film he reviewed was that bad. The next morning, Arvind, who was still at Kartik's house, suddenly received an emergency call from the art museum and immediately went there with his team. Not long after Arvind left, Danny came to Kartik's apartment to give him flowers with a plastic yellow leaf pattern secretly. It turns out that the night before, it was Danny who killed the next critic, Govind Pandey, not Kartik. That's because Govind gave 4.5 stars. Though it is very clear that the movie he reviewed was bad, as discussed by Kartik. It has been revealed that Danny was the one who killed the critic all along. It can be concluded that those who are killed are not those who give low ratings. However, those who give ratings are not appropriate. Good movies been rated bad, bad movies are rated good. Psychopathically, Danny slashes Govind's cheek. Danny blamed him for lying to the audience by giving a good review to a bad movie. In addition, Govind also said in his video that the movie he reviewed had a very beautiful scene, like an absurd painting. That means this time Danny will kill him according to Govind's words, which is to slash him absurdly like a painting. Danny also gave 4.5 stars on his forehead exactly like Govind's score. Seeing Govind's gruesome corpse, Arvind could only remain silent and stoned, because again and again the perpetrator was done to launch his murder. According to the museum, there was a gunshot that made the security guard immediately deactivate the main electricity switch off in panic. It was precisely when the lights and CCTV in the building were completely off, Danny could freely start his murder. Moreover, Arvind's superior officer, the DGP of Crime Branch, Mumbai, gave him only 3 more weeks before the case was handed over to the CBI, or India's Central Bureau of Investigation, as per the Home Minister's order. With 4 tragic murders with no clue as to who the culprit was, the Indian Critics Guild held a candlelight march in front of the police building and decided not to write any movie reviews until the killer was found. Meanwhile at home, Danny was watching the 1959 film Kaagaz Ki Phool, starring his favorite actor, Guru Dutt. The movie was legendary in India for its revolutionary cinematography and powerful storytelling in its day. It was also preferred as the autobiography of Guru Dutt himself. However, the work was considered bad and ugly by critics at the time. In the end, he lost his fortune and passed away a few years later, allegedly due to suicide. While watching Kaagaz Ki Phool, Danny seems both laughing and crying. The story flashes back to before all the murders happened. At his home, Danny is sitting in front of his altar of worship of Guru Dutt while chatting and joking with himself. He was planning to make a movie series about himself and his other personalities. It turns out that he has prepared a complete storyboard of the series episodes. Then it was shown how sadistically Danny killed his 3 victims. Starting from Nitin in the bathroom, Urshad on the train tracks, to Parikshit on the cricket field. These were all the episodes of the movie series that he wanted. And Arvind's guess turned out to be right. In the first murder, Danny hadn't finished his star incision. This was because Nitin's wife had arrived at the house earlier. To speed up the investigation before the CBI takes over, Arvind finally collaborates with a criminal psychologist named Dr. Zenobia Shroff to find out more about the psychopathic serial killer's way of thinking. According to Zenobia, the killer is a man. And after comparing articles from other critics, Zenobia was convinced that the 4 victims had something in common in their articles, namely a very interesting script for a murder. That's why other critics who gave higher ratings in the 4th murder were not targeted. Similarly, other critics in the 1st through 3rd murders who gave lower reviews were also not targeted because the language of the reviews was not interesting enough to be a murder. In addition, Zenobia also believes that the perpetrator had a mission to save the movie theater. That's because he always kills movie critics with fake criticism, as well as interesting review words that will harm the movie theater. As the police continue to investigate who the killer is, without any suspicion, Neela grows closer to Danny, a psycho serial killer. They ride bikes in the rain, play at the beach, bribe each other, until Danny finally has a romantic encounter with Neela at her florist shop. And while this is going on, Neela sees a pile of roll films under Danny's closet. After his girlfriend came home, Danny scolded himself for being so careless that Neela saw the stack of rolls. Danny immediately took the rolls to his basement. But because it was too heavy, the roll fell along with a storage box containing plastic wrappers with yellow leaf motifs. There were also clapperboards and movie posters. It turns out that 10 years ago, before his mother died, Danny made an autobiographical movie about himself called Chup. But all the critics berated the movie with low ratings, which made Danny depressed until he was admitted to a mental hospital. During his treatment, his mother often visited him and always gave him flowers wrapped in plastic with a yellow leaf pattern, like the award logo on movie posters. Because according to him, Danny's movie was the best movie his mother had ever seen. According to Dr. Zenobia's research, so far the yellow leaf patterned plastic used by the killer was produced 10 years ago. So Zenobia asked Arvind and Srini to make a list of directors whose last movie was destroyed by critics approximately 10 to 12 years ago. Finally, they got back in touch with Kartik. He remembered director Guru Dutt, whose legendary and last film, Kagas Ki Fool, had been severely criticized in those days, which made Guru Dutt depressed, and he passed away a few years later. Yet today, Kagas Ki Fool is hailed as one of India's all-time masterpieces. To make the data collection process faster, Kartik was assisted by his subordinate, who was none other than Neela. They managed to find 216 names of directors whose last movie was released about 10 years ago. Movies that have been destroyed by critics' reviews. But unfortunately, most of them were not listed or did not have social media. Then when Kartik's wife brings in a parcel of cake, Arvind is surprised and asks where she got the yellow leaf patterned parcel of cake exactly like the one used by the killer. Kartik explains that it was a former bouquet wrapper delivered to his house on the day Arvind investigated the murder of Govind, the 4th victim at the museum. Arvind immediately checked the apartment hallway CCTV. But cleverly, it turns out that Danny, who already knew there was CCTV there, sent the parcel through a child in Kartik's apartment building. Of course, no trace of Danny was recorded. Plus, because Danny wore a hoodie and sunglasses, the boy who received the parcel could not describe Danny's figure clearly. On the way home from Kartik's house, Neela thought about all the results of the investigation. The connection with Danny, from the plastic wrapping, Danny's paper flower, that means Kagas Ki Fool, the pile of film rolls in Danny's house, to when Danny choked when Neela discussed film critics in front of him. Plus, when she got home, her mom told her that Danny had been there and gave her a gift. Neela immediately opened the gift. Surprisingly, the content of the gift was a movie roll, but when opened, it turned out that the contents were just flowers. Seeing that, Neela cried because she had suspected her lover, even though he was the real killer. Because the time given by the government to investigate the case is getting less and less, Arvind also plans to lure the perpetrator by making a perverse movie review. For example, deliberately giving a 1-star rating for a quality movie. Of course, none of the critics, including Kartik, wanted to cooperate with the police for the review because they still feared for their lives. But finally, Arvind offers the dangerous job to Neela, an entertainment reporter who desperately wants to be a movie critic. Getting the offer, even though it was her dream job, Neela could still put herself in danger. Neela then talked about it to her mother, who supported her. Since childhood, her daughter had loved writing movie reviews. Therefore, Neela had agreed to Arvind's offer. A few days later, the media made a statement that movie criticism in India would be back in circulation after being absent for almost a week. Knowing the news, Danny happily said an opportunity like this was what he waiting for, because he had been no-kill people for a long time. On the other hand, Arvind and the police have also guarded the theater where 5 film critics, including Neela, will watch a movie called Ding Dong, which they will later review. Fortunately, the movie screening was safe. However, on the way home, even though Neela and the other critics thought the movie was very good, Arvind forced Neela to write a very bad review. With 1 star as a result of her judgment, even though it didn't match the quality of the movie, which was certainly better than that. In this way, Arvind hoped to lure the perpetrator, Danny, to come out and continue his act. Meanwhile at home, Danny frantically calls Neela repeatedly and thinks that his girlfriend has dumped him. Neela is busy working with the police to solve a psychopathic murder case. Ironically, without Neela realizing that the serial killer she was luring was her own lover, Danny. After Neela finished her article, Arvind secured Neela's mother for a few days. Arvind also began to spread his troops around Neela's apartment, which was right next building to the movie studio. Starting from intelligence troops, CCTV cameras, to Arvind himself guarding Neela's unit. On the other hand, since Neela is still unreachable, Danny goes to watch the movie Ding Dong alone, complete with double popcorn, because he has a split personality. At the investigation headquarters, under Zenobia's command, her team had uploaded all the contents of the Ding Dong movie review, including Neela's article. Meanwhile at home, Danny checked every review that had been uploaded. He was so surprised to see one review that gave a false assessment, which turned out to be made by Neela. Whereas other critics, all of them almost gave ratings above 3 stars. However, even though Neela is his idol and lover, as a psychopath who must complete his mission, Danny will still kill Neela according to the words written in the review article. Meanwhile at home, Neela is terrified that either she or her mother will be murdered, even though police forces, including Arvind, have deployed heavy and tightly secure the area. Not long after, Danny arrives at Neela's apartment. When the security guard called to confirm, Neela snatched the phone from Arvind and asked Danny to meet her in her unit immediately because Neela was very scared. Finally, Arvind allowed Danny to go upstairs, but only for 5 minutes. Moments later, Neela fell asleep. They left her in the room alone. Danny was angry with Arvind because the police should have provided security instead of using Neela as bait. Danny also insisted that he be allowed to accompany his girlfriend. However, as a professional police officer, Arvind clearly forbade anyone from being there, except himself and Neela. Then suddenly, there was a scream from Neela's room. Turns out she was just having a nightmare. Seeing Neela, who was scared, Arvind finally let Danny temporarily in the room to calm Neela down. It was a wrong decision by Arvind. At the slightest opportunity, Danny was able to trick all the police there. Arvind still didn't realize that what he saw on the bed was just a pile of pillows covered by a blanket. Meanwhile, Neela has been tied up and thrown into the field of the movie studio next to the apartment. After being evicted and escorted out of the apartment by the police, Danny immediately went to the movie studio next building. Then immediately brought Neela, who was already bleeding from being thrown from a high floor, and entered the movie studio to start intimidating her. It was discovered that Danny's real name was Sebastian Gomes, while Danny is the name of his dog who was killed by his own father. Henceforth, Danny will be called Sebastian. In the soundproof studio room, Sebastian continues to intimidate Neela for forgetting his feelings of love. Even when Neela confesses that the review article was just a police instruction and that she honestly gave a 4-star rating to the movie Ding Dong, Sebastian just laughs and doesn't believe her at all. Meanwhile, at Neela's apartment, Arvind saw Sebastian's bike that was left there. Arvind had asked his subordinates to contact Sebastian, but there was no answer at all. Then, after remembering Sebastian's hand gesture that stroked Neela's forehead, Arvind realized that Sebastian was estimating the star incision on Neela's head. Suddenly, all the police on guard immediately calmed the studio area. So did Arvind, whose leg was badly sprained after jumping from the 4th floor. Meanwhile, in the studio, Sebastian prepares to kill Neela by dropping a spotlight on her head, according to his review of the movie Ding Dong, which is brain damage. But to buying time, Neela asks Sebastian, if movie criticism is someone's opinion, is there a movie that gets the same review from all critics? There is, Sebastian said. Sebastian easily answered that 10 years ago, he released a movie called Chup, which means silence. But unfortunately, all the critics insulted and berated the movie with low ratings. Then suddenly, right before the light fell on his head, Neela again bought time by asking whether Sebastian actually didn't like his own movie either, because criticism is very painful for artists who are not confident in their own work. At the same time, fortunately Arvind, who heard Neela's shout, immediately entered the studio. Eventually, a struggle ensued to subdue Sebastian. After everything was over, Neela was treated until she got better. And Neela's mother was very happy when she found out that her daughter was back. On the other hand, Sebastian's gunshot wound was operated on. His entire house was searched by the police. A dog grave with Danny's name on it, an altar to Guru Dutt, and a plastic yellow leaf pattern were found, along with Sebastian's Chup film roll. These were used as evidence for investigation purposes. Sebastian's movie was watched by Arvind, Zenobia, Srini, and Neela. They were very surprised by the content of the movie. It turns out that Chup is a biotic or biographical movie that tells Sebastian's life from childhood to adulthood. The movie contained him and his mother continuing to experience physical violence from his father. The movie depicts a boy repeatedly locked up in the basement of the house with his mouth and hands tied using plastic. In his solitude, Sebastian began to give birth to his second personality, and his love for Guru Dutt began to emerge because he saw from the basement window his neighbors who were watching his films. Sebastian grew older and entered film studies. Meanwhile, his father's violence gets worse. He even killed Sebastian's favorite dog, Danny. Because he was too furious, Sebastian, who had grown up and could fight back, finally locked his father in a warehouse. His father was fed improvised food through his mother on Sebastian's orders, and that's when Sebastian wrote a Chup movie script while keeping an eye on his locked-up father until his father finally died. After seeing Sebastian's Chup movie, Arvind and Neela are convinced that Sebastian's deep trauma has made him a psychopath. But according to Zenobia, it was Sebastian's bitter life that made him a great artist. But it was the critics who triggered Sebastian to become a psychopath, for berating and laughing at Chup's movie without knowing the horrific and heartbreaking story behind it. After the bullet in his body was removed, and because he was proven to be a suspect and was convicted of mental illness, Sebastian was detained forever, either in prison or in a mental hospital. In his cell, Sebastian is given 2 special meals based on his dual personality. Sebastian still often talks to himself. He also feels happy every time he hears that a movie critic has died. After all the murders he committed, Chup's movie was finally recognized by various circles as a quality movie. It even received various famous awards. The movie was finished.